The Roy Lee Ward case is one of the most shocking stories in the history of Indiana death row. In 2001, the brutal Stacy Payne murder devastated Spencer County, Indiana, and sparked a decades-long battle over the death penalty in Indiana. For more than 20 years, the Roy Lee Ward death penalty case has been filled with courtroom drama, endless appeals, and the painful wait for justice. Now, with the Indiana execution 2025 date set, the world is watching to see if the sentence will finally be carried out. Make sure you subscribe to this channel and stay with me until the very end, because what happens next in the Roy Lee Ward Indiana death row story will leave you speechless. On July 11, 2001, the small town of Spencer County, Indiana, was shattered by a crime that horrified the entire state. 15-year-old Stacy Payne was raped and murdered inside her own home, a brutal act that left her family and community devastated. Within hours, investigators identified a suspect, Roy Lee Ward, a 24-year-old drifter. His arrest sent shockwaves through Indiana, sparking outrage and demand for justice. The Stacy Payne murder case quickly became one of the most notorious in Indiana's history, raising fierce debates over crime, punishment, and the death penalty. For the Payne family, it was the start of a long fight for justice. For Ward, it was the beginning of a journey that would end on Indiana's death row. But what unfolded in the courtroom would reveal disturbing details that shocked the jury and led to one of the harshest punishments the state could deliver. The trial of Roy Lee Ward began in 2002, and the details that emerged in court sent shockwaves through Indiana. Prosecutors laid out the horrific timeline of July 11, 2001, showing the jury how Ward entered Stacy Payne's home and carried out a crime that left her family shattered forever. The courtroom was packed. Local and national media followed every word. The Stacy Payne murder trial became one of the most watched in Indiana's history because of its brutality and the pressing question: would Indiana sentence Roy Lee Ward to death? The prosecution presented evidence that painted a picture of cold violence. They showed how Stacy Payne was overpowered, sexually assaulted, and murdered. Her family sat in the courtroom, forced to relive the pain of that day as every grim detail was read into the record. The defense team fought to humanize Ward, arguing that his background, mental health, and personal struggles should be considered. But the overwhelming weight of the evidence left little doubt in the minds of the jurors. When the time came for deliberation, the jury returned with a decision that would define the case: guilty on all counts. The jury didn't stop there. They recommended the death penalty, a sentence reserved for the worst crimes under Indiana law. In 2002, the judge followed that recommendation and formally sentenced Roy Lee Ward to death. Additional long prison terms were also imposed for the related convictions. The courtroom was silent as the sentence was read, but the silence was heavy with emotion. For Stacy Payne's family, it was a moment of justice. For Ward, it was the beginning of a new chapter on Indiana's death row. But the story was far from over. A death sentence is never the end in America. Instead, it marked the start of a long and exhausting journey through appeals, legal challenges, and years of waiting. The death sentence was delivered. But as the years stretched into decades, Roy Lee Ward's case would expose the deep flaws, delays, and controversies of the American death penalty system. After his 2002 death sentence, Roy Lee Ward became one of Indiana's most infamous death row inmates. Yet, as the years passed, the case became less about the crime itself and more about the slow and often frustrating process of capital punishment in the United States. Ward and his defense attorneys filed appeal after appeal, each one seeking to overturn or delay the execution. The arguments ranged from claims about trial procedure to constitutional challenges to Indiana's method of execution. At every step, the Stacy Payne family was forced to relive their tragedy as the case dragged on. Indiana, like many other states, struggled with practical and legal obstacles in carrying out executions. By the 2010s and 2020s, the state faced increasing controversy over lethal injection drugs, supply shortages, and lawsuits over whether the state's execution protocol met constitutional standards. These statewide battles meant that Ward's case remained in limbo. For over 20 years, Stacy Payne's murder was remembered in news headlines whenever another appeal was filed. Journalists described Ward as one of the most high-profile inmates on Indiana's death row. To some, the case became a symbol of why the death penalty system was broken. To others, it was proof that justice was being denied to a grieving family. Ward's attorneys continued to file motions, seeking to prove that a conviction or sentence was unconstitutional. Courts rejected one appeal after another, yet every rejection still pushed the execution further down the line. For the Payne family, justice seemed trapped in endless paperwork. For Ward, time on death row stretched longer and longer, while the legal fight continued. The crime had happened in 2001, but by 2025, no execution had taken place. Then, in 2025, everything changed. After 2 decades of delays, the Indiana Supreme Court made a ruling that would finally set the clock ticking toward Roy Lee Ward's execution. In mid-2025, the Indiana Attorney General's office made a bold move. They petitioned the Indiana Supreme Court to set an execution date for Roy Lee Ward. After years of appeals and delays, the state argued it was time to carry out the sentence that a jury had delivered more than 2 decades earlier. The court agreed. In the summer of 2025, the Indiana Supreme Court tentatively scheduled Ward's execution for October 10, 2025. In August, the court finalized a date, rejecting Ward's latest appeal and declaring that he had not met the legal standard to reopen his case. It was a historic moment. Indiana had not carried out an execution in years, and the Ward case was set to become one of the most significant death penalty events in the state's modern history. News outlets across the country reported the decision. For supporters of the death penalty, it was long overdue justice. For critics, it was a chilling reminder of a punishment many argued should be abolished. The Payne family issued public statements urging the state to follow through. They said it was time for closure, time for the justice system to finally keep its promise. At the same time, Ward's defense team redoubled its efforts, filing emergency motions and preparing for a final battle to stop the execution. The announcement of the date ignited intense debate. Protesters on both sides of the death penalty issue began organizing. Religious leaders, activists, and legal experts weighed in. The Roy Lee Ward execution date became national news. But even with the execution scheduled, one last avenue remained: clemency. And the fight over clemency would bring raw emotion, desperate pleas, and a final decision from Indiana's highest office. As October 10th, 2025 drew closer, attention shifted to Indiana's clemency process. Roy Lee Ward's attorneys filed for executive clemency, asking the state to commute his death sentence to life in prison. In September 2025, the Indiana Parole Board held a public hearing. Ward's defense team argued that he had shown remorse and pointed to mental health factors, including a diagnosis of autism. They urged the board to consider mercy after more than 20 years on death row. On the other side, the family of Stacy Payne spoke with powerful emotion. They told the board and the governor that mercy should not be given to a man who had taken Stacy's life. They said the only just outcome was the sentence the jury had already decided in 2002, death. The parole board ultimately recommended against clemency. The final decision rested with Governor Mike Braun, who faced immense pressure from both supporters and opponents of the death penalty. For weeks, speculation grew. Would he grant clemency or allow the execution to proceed? On September 29th, 2025, Governor Braun made his decision public. He announced that he would allow the execution to go forward. He would not intervene. For the Payne family, it was a statement they had waited over 2 decades to hear. For Ward's defense team, it was a devastating blow. With the governor's announcement, the countdown to October 10th, 2025 became very real. Ward's attorneys continued filing emergency motions, but the legal options were closing. Unless a court issued a last-minute stay, Roy Lee Ward would be executed by lethal injection at the Indiana State Prison. The case had come full circle. From the murder of Stacy Payne in 2001, to a trial in 2002, to more than 20 years of appeals and delays, and finally to a set date for the execution. Now, the world watches as October 10th approaches. Will Roy Lee Ward's execution finally take place after decades of delay, or will one last legal twist stop it at the very last moment?